you can just show up here after all this time and expect me to welcome you with open arms?
You can't just stroll in and declare that dock yours. That was the very first thing out of her mouth, shouted at me before I even had a clue who she was. I had barely set my moving boxes down when she came storming across my lawn like she owned the entire neighborhood, ranting about rules and community access. No introduction, no neighborly welcome, just straight-up entitlement. As if my property was some kind of playground toy she was determined to keep out of my hands. And the little posse trailing behind her, clipboard and all, made the whole thing feel even stranger. Tell me in the comments if you've ever met someone like that on day one. I bought this cabin on the lake because I thought it would finally give me peace after 3 years of soul-crushing corporate politics. At 38, I was burned out managing logistics for a shipping company and desperate for a quiet place to recharge on weekends. The realtor showed me this spot one Tuesday afternoon in late September, and I knew instantly it was the one. Weathered cedar siding, a stone fireplace, and best of all, a wooden dock stretching 50 feet out over the clear waters of Lake Harrison. The paperwork was simple, the inspections spotless, and I closed 3 weeks later with cash pulled from my retirement savings. It felt like the first wise move I'd made in ages. Moving day started at 7 sharp. I was actually in a good mood, hauling boxes from my truck to the covered porch. The crisp air smelled of pine and lake water, a welcome change from years of stale, recycled office air. I had just set down my first load inside when I heard voices coming from the direction of my dock. Peering out the kitchen window, I saw 3 people strolling down it as if it were their own. Leading them was a woman in her 50s, hair perfectly styled, clutching a stack of laminated papers while waving dramatically toward the water. A stocky man in khakis followed, scribbling in a notebook with way too much enthusiasm. The third figure lagged behind, harder to make out. My initial thought was they might be neighbors dropping by to introduce themselves, but their stiff, purposeful movements told me otherwise. I stepped outside, still in my scruffy moving clothes, unprepared for whatever this was. The blonde woman spotted me immediately and charged up the slope toward my cabin with the kind of stride that screamed confrontation. "You must be the new owner," she called, her tone making it clear this wasn't a friendly welcome. "I'm Victoria Hale, president of the Lakeview Shores Homeowners Association. We need to talk about your dock." The man behind her introduced himself as Clark Benson, some kind of HOA enforcement officer. The smug grin on his face told me he was enjoying this far too much. The third person was another board member, but I forgot their name instantly. I was too busy trying to figure out what their angle was. Victoria wasted no time with pleasantries. She flipped through her papers and began reciting what sounded like a pre-written speech about dock access and shared marina use. According to her, my dock was technically community property under the HOA rules, and I needed to hand over control immediately so they could roll out something she called the Marina Pass program. Seasonal dock access for $200 per resident, she explained matter-of-factly. Since my dock supposedly served as the main entry point, I'd need to remove any private property signs and allow everyone in the community free use. Clark chimed in, warning that refusing would trigger daily fines starting at $50 and climbing higher. I stood there, stunned, but I didn't interrupt. I let them go through their entire spiel in silence. That silence seemed to rattle Victoria. She fidgeted, with her stack of papers shuffling through increasingly blurry photocopies, each less legible than the last. Finally, she stopped and smirked. "So, what's your answer?" I looked from her to Clark, then down at the messy stack of documents. "Can you show me the deed that proves this dock belongs to the HOA?" I asked evenly. Her expression shifted immediately. Instead of answering, she pivoted to vague talk about covenant interpretations and community standards. Clark tried to sound intimidating, tossing out threats about inspections and violation notices, but I just repeated the same question, calmly, over and over. I wasn't being stubborn. I had poured a fortune into this place, and I wasn't about to surrender part of it because someone waved around some photocopied pages and barked threats. The whole exchange felt surreal, like I had wandered into a world where strangers could show up and simply demand your property. At that point, I pulled out my phone and hit record. That wiped the smugness off their faces. Suddenly, Victoria was going on about privacy and inappropriate recording, which was laughable considering she was standing on my dock making demands. Told them plainly that I would need to see actual legal documents before any further discussion. That shut things down fast. The three of them huddled together and marched back down the dock, whispering to each other and glancing over their shoulders. At me. Victoria's voice grew louder as they got farther away, but I couldn't make out the words. When they were finally gone, I stood on my porch in silence, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. I slipped my hand into my pocket and drew out the old brass key that had come with the property, something the former owner had mentioned almost as an afterthought during the closing. "You'll figure out what it unlocks," he had said with a sly smile. At the time, I'd been too buried in the stack of paperwork to ask him to explain. Now, standing in the late afternoon sun with the key glinting in my hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this place than I had first believed. The metal, though dulled with age, felt heavy and reliable, etched with detailed patterns that seemed hand-carved decades earlier. Strange markings covered its surface, an anchor, what looked like a directional arrow, and other symbols I couldn't identify. Whatever it was meant to open, it was clearly important enough that the owner insisted it remain. I cracked the door just wide enough to take the documents, and immediately he launched into a monologue about violation notices and inspection schedules. "These citations are effective immediately," he declared with the self-importance of a law officer, though in reality he was nothing more than an HOA zealot with too much time. I wanted to ask if he seriously had nothing better to do at dawn, but I was too tired to start sparring with him. The papers he handed me looked comically unprofessional. Cheap copy paper, clip art borders, and fonts straight out of a 1990s word processor. The first notice accused me of unauthorized private signage, referring to the modest private Pier sign that had been posted there long before I bought the place. The second charged me with failure to register watercraft access equipment, which I assumed meant the pier itself, though the wording was so vague it could have applied to nearly anything. The third and strangest citation was for non-compliance with community marina integration protocols, a phrase that sounded like it had been pulled out of thin air. Each violation carried a $50 per day fine, with Benson emphasizing that the penalties would double every week until I complied. When I asked where these mysterious protocols were written, he simply tapped his briefcase as though that were a sufficient answer. But it wasn't just the phony paperwork that unsettled me. It was the sudden shift in how my neighbors were behaving. The woman across the street, who had always waved when I passed by, kept her eyes glued to her phone when I went to the mailbox. The older man, who had introduced himself warmly my first week, now refused to meet my gaze. Conversations on porches cut off the moment I stepped outside. It was obvious Victoria had already begun spinning her version of the story, and the community was buying into it. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things or if I really was the target of an organized effort to push me out. Either way, the effect was the same. I felt unwelcome. The whole situation was starting to resemble high school politics, except here the bullies came armed with official paperwork and financial threats. Instead of wallowing, I turned to research. On my laptop, I pulled up satellite images of my property and compared them against county land records available online. That's when I spotted something odd. One of the lot line overlays had been misfiled, showing that my property extended much farther into the lake than I had originally thought. The official county records didn't line up with Victoria's claims, nor did they support her insistence that my pier somehow belonged to the community. I sketched out the dock's measurements on a notepad, cross-referencing them with the satellite maps. The more I studied, the more convinced I became that the HOA's version of the property lines was not only misleading, it was flat out wrong. I began pacing inside the cabin, trying to make sense of what I had uncovered. No matter how much I turned it over in my mind, I couldn't quite grasp the significance. Hoping for some clarity, I decided to walk the property and look for something tangible that might shed light on the boundary dispute. Following the tree. Lying behind my cabin, I came across a narrow trail that wound its way to the shoreline, about 100 yards east of my pier. There, hidden in the thick grass and cattails, Something caught my eye and made me freeze. Nearly swallowed by decades of overgrowth was an old boundary marker. The metal post, rusted and leaning awkwardly, still bore faint engravings that matched the designs on the brass key I had found the day before. I had to tug away layers of tangled vines and weeds to get a clear look, but there was no doubt. It lined up directly with my pier. Pulling out my phone, I snapped multiple photos from different angles, making sure to capture the GPS coordinates shown on the screen. The carvings on the metal weren't machine-stamped. They were clearly done by hand, and they looked as if they predated the HOA by decades. One resembled an anchor, another a key, and the third appeared to be some sort of compass or directional symbol. As I studied them, a memory surfaced, something Frank Morrison had told me in passing. He once said the HOA had always resented him for reasons they couldn't prove, but he never explained further. Now, standing in front of that weathered marker and thinking about the key he left me, I began to realize there was a history here, much deeper than anyone had admitted. On my way back, I crossed paths with Harold Green, an older man who lived in one of the original cottages near the community entrance. He had to be pushing 70, his skin tanned and his hands worn from a lifetime of outdoor work. Harold always struck me as someone who knew this place better than most. He was kneeling in his flower bed, pulling weeds when I walked past. Looking up with a cautious expression, he gave me a quiet greeting. "Morning, Derek," he said, glancing around to make sure no one else was near. "Heard you had some visitors yesterday." His tone made it clear he had likely witnessed the entire confrontation from his garden. I wondered just how much of the neighborhood drama he had seen over the years. When Harold spoke, it was in hesitant fragments, like he was testing whether it was safe to share. According to him, the HOA had been quietly redrawing property lines for years, claiming docks and shoreline areas as community amenities so they could justify extra fees. People used to know exactly where private property ended and the association's land began, he explained, his voice still low. But Victoria had been bending the definitions, especially when water access was involved. He told me that several owners had been pressured into giving up their private dock rights in exchange for lower dues, and that the HOA had been floating the idea of a Marina pass system for months. When I asked if anyone had ever fought these changes in court, he just shook his head, his face carrying the weary look of someone who had watched too many battles end in defeat. The part that stood out most was Harold's recollection of Frank Morrison, the previous owner of my cabin. Frank had lived there more than 30 years before moving to a retirement home last spring. Harold said Frank always insisted that his pier and waterfront access were completely outside HOA control, and that he had documents proving it, records, dating back to the original lake development in the 1960s. He also mentioned that Frank always carried a brass key, claiming it represented something important about local property rights. When I told Harold that Frank had left me a similar key, his eyes widened. He suggested I look into the original land surveys and warned me that Victoria had never forgiven Frank for refusing to bend. Now that I had moved in, she likely saw me as her chance to finally claim that pier. And in that moment, it clicked. This wasn't about supposed rule violations. It was about ownership. That Thursday afternoon, a notice appeared in my mailbox. It was printed on official letterhead, my name highlighted under a section titled Property Violations and Community. Standards Review. Victoria had wasted no time organizing a public hearing. From the stern language in the letter, it was clear she intended this to be my final humiliation before forcing me to hand over the pier. The meeting was set for Saturday evening at the clubhouse, a rustic building overlooking the marina, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a perfect view of the dock at the heart of the dispute. I spent Friday night going over every piece of paperwork from my property purchase, searching for anything that might shed light on what I was really up against. The deeper I dug into the documents, the more uncertain I became about the connection between my pier and the larger marina system. By Saturday evening, the weather had turned unseasonably warm, the kind that draws everyone out of their cabins. I watched as neighbors drifted toward the clubhouse in small groups, their voices low as they spoke among themselves. When I arrived, the place was already crowded. Folding chairs had been lined up in neat rows, facing a long table where Victoria and 3 board members sat with piles of papers spread out in front of them. Clark stood near the entrance, checking names against his clipboard like a guard screening guests at a trial. That's exactly what it felt like. More courtroom than... Victoria called the meeting to order with a performance so polished it was clear she'd been rehearsing for days. She began with a scripted statement about unity, cooperation, and the duty of each property owner to prioritize the community's shared resources over personal interests, especially when it came to waterfront access. Then her tone sharpened. She launched into what could only be described as an attack on my character, rattling off supposed violations and disruptions that painted me as a disruptive outsider bent on undermining the HOA's authority. In her telling, I had been combative and unwilling to cooperate from the very moment she welcomed me, refusing any good-faith discussion about pier access. What infuriated me most was how she twisted our past interactions, making herself look reasonable while casting me as obstinate. She described her first visit to my cabin as a friendly attempt to go over community policies, leaving out the part where she demanded I hand over access to my pier immediately, without showing a shred of legal documentation. She portrayed Clark's early morning citation delivery as routine administrative work rather than the blatant intimidation tactic it truly was. When she finished, she opened the floor for input. The room shifted uncomfortably. It was obvious the residents were being pressured to pick sides in a conflict most of them barely understood. A handful spoke up in her defense, repeating her lines about cooperation and sacrifice. One woman claimed, "My refusal to share pier access was preventing her grandchildren from safely enjoying the lake, though plenty of other access points existed." An older man worried aloud about falling property values if owners could block community amenities, as if my private pier had ever been one. The whole exchange felt rehearsed, as though Victoria had spent the week coaching people on exactly what to say. I noticed Harold Green seated near the front. He stared at his hands, staying silent. When Victoria finally asked if I wanted to respond, I rose slowly, scanning the rows of expectant faces. I could have delivered a long rebuttal outlining property rights and pointing out the holes in every accusation she made. Instead, I simply smiled and said, "Victoria, I already asked you that question back at my cabin, and I don't need to ask it again. What I'll do instead is tell you what I've learned since then." The room went still. I took a steady breath. This isn't about my pier, it's about a pattern of behavior. I briefly described my conversation with Harold and hinted at the inconsistencies in the property maps, careful not to reveal the strongest evidence I held. A stir swept through the crowd, and even some of Victoria's supporters leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "Where's their deed?" someone from the back called out, this time directed at Victoria. She launched into a rambling explanation about covenants and precedents, but the momentum had shifted. My short statement had reframed the entire meeting, not as a clash between me and the HOA, but as a deeper mystery, and now the residents wanted answers. I thanked everyone for listening and walked toward the exit, knowing my words had landed harder than I'd anticipated. On the drive home, the night felt longer than usual, heavy with the realization that I might be fighting a battle I couldn't win. Victoria still held sway over a portion of the community, and her role as HOA president gave her the power to control the narrative in ways I couldn't match. Yet her evasiveness, the way she kept avoiding actual documentation, convinced me this was more than just a simple property dispute. Back at my cabin, I pulled up the boundary marker photos on my computer. The GPS coordinates and carved symbols now looked like puzzle pieces slowly coming together. I had the sense that tomorrow would bring clarity Victoria wasn't prepared for. Tomorrow I would bring the only map that mattered, the waterline survey. That night, the first cold snap of the season hit. The wind whipped off the lake, rattling my windows, making sleep impossible. I'd spent the weekend researching property law and trying to track down the surveying company Harold had mentioned, but their office was closed until Monday. The waiting left me uneasy, with the creeping sense that time was slipping away. Victoria's public humiliation of me on Saturday was clearly intended to cut me off from the rest of the community, and from the way neighbors avoided eye contact. When I walked to the mailbox this morning, I had to admit, her plan was working far too well. The strain of it all was beginning to wear me down in ways I hadn't anticipated, and I found myself questioning whether buying this cabin had really been the peaceful retreat I imagined. It was around 11 p.m., and I was sitting at my kitchen table, going through the title paperwork for what felt like the 100th time when I heard footsteps on the porch. At first, I thought it could be an animal or maybe a branch dropping from one of the tall pines, but then came the unmistakable sound of paper being slid under the front door. I hesitated before checking, partly because I was exhausted from the constant drama and partly because the timing felt unsettling. When I finally opened the door, there it was, a folded sheet of paper, scrawled in block letters that sent a chill through me. Sell or regret it. Last warning. No name, no letterhead. Just those 5 words. But in that instant, the dispute stopped being about property lines or HOA rules and turned into something darker, something personal. For the next hour, I paced the cabin, checking every door and window, suddenly hyper-aware of just how isolated this place was. The nearest neighbor was 200 yards away, and with the wind howling through the trees, no one would hear a thing if something happened. I kept telling myself the note was probably just Clark trying to play mind games, but the anonymity made it feel more sinister, like someone was willing to push this fight far beyond HOA complaints. I locked everything twice, drew the curtains, and told myself I was being ridiculous for fearing a single piece of paper. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone out there in the darkness was watching me. If you've ever felt your own neighbors turning into your enemies, you know how deeply unsettling it can be. By Tuesday morning, their intimidation campaign was impossible to ignore. Both of my truck's tires had been slashed during the night, clean, deliberate cuts from a knife, not an accident. I called the county sheriff to report it, but the deputy who showed up seemed far more focused on the HOA feud than the vandalism itself. He implied that these kinds of conflicts often escalate beyond legal channels, hinting that I should consider giving in before things went further. His tone made it clear he saw this as a civil squabble, not a crime. And I couldn't shake the sense that Victoria's side of the story had already filtered through back channels to law enforcement. That conversation was still gnawing at me late Wednesday night when I noticed movement by the pier. Lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and debating whether I should just sell the place, I saw flashlights cutting through the dark. At least 2 figures were down at the dock, inspecting the structure, taking measurements, or maybe photos. I grabbed my binoculars and watched from the window as they spent nearly 20 minutes documenting whatever they needed. When they finally left, they walked not toward any nearby cabin, but straight back to the community center. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't random trespassing. It was an HOA operation. The next morning brought yet another escalation. A certified letter waited in my mailbox sent from a county law firm, warning of immediate legal action if I didn't stop interfering with Marina operations. The letter was loaded with legal jargon, easements, public access rights, violations. But what hit me hardest was the reference to recent property inspections. Clearly, the people I had seen at my pier hadn't just been snooping. They were conducting some kind of official evaluation without ever bothering to inform me or ask permission. By now it was obvious. This wasn't just a dispute. It was a coordinated effort to drive me out entirely. I was moments away from calling a realtor when my father's words came back to me, advice he had given years ago about dealing with bullies at work. Documentation beats confrontation every single time. So instead of packing up and running, I made a different decision. I would fight back, and I would use the one weapon bullies never expect their targets to wield well: evidence. I'm a single mom. Where was I supposed to keep it? My garage barely has enough space for my car, and the HOA doesn't allow storage anywhere else on the property. Her story struck a chord with other residents who had also felt the sting of Victoria's enforcement efforts. It became clearer by the day that this wasn't truly about neighborhood safety or preserving property values. Harold Green showed up with his wife, a soft-spoken woman who rarely contributed during meetings, but seemed genuinely curious about the pier and its connection to the larger Marina system. By 7:30, more than 20 people had gathered on my pier. The mood was warm and easygoing, the kind of neighborly atmosphere that had originally drawn me to lakefront living. People peppered me with questions about property lines and the Pier's history, and I found myself repeating what I'd learned from Harold and my lawyer friend about the community's early development plans. The most eye-opening discussion of the evening happened when several residents began comparing experiences with the HOA's financial decisions. Victoria had been warning for months about costly marina repairs, insisting that major upgrades were necessary to keep water access safe. But when we looked at the actual budget documents, we saw that the HOA had already collected more than $50,000, earmarked for dock work and marina upkeep. Strangely, no one could recall seeing a single improvement funded by that money. "The same docks have been falling apart for 3 years," complained one man who owned a small fishing boat. "We keep paying these extra fees for repairs that never get done, and now they're trying to charge us $200 apiece for marina passes on top of our dues." That was when Megan finally voiced what everyone else had been thinking. She stood on my pier with her children beside her, gazing back toward the community center, where Victoria likely sat, and projected her words so loudly they carried across the water. "Don't turn our marina into a cash machine," she declared. "We already pay HOA dues for community upkeep. We shouldn't be billed again for access to something that's supposed to be covered." Her statement was met with applause from families on the dock, heads nodding in agreement as people realized this fight wasn't really about my pier. Victoria had simply seized on my property as a convenient pretext for imposing a new fee system, one that lacked transparency about where the money was going. The gathering began to taper off around 9 when I spotted Clark Benson lurking at the edge of my lot, half hidden by the tree line. He was snapping photos of the crowd and fiddling with his phone, no doubt logging violations for yet another round of citations. Other residents noticed him too, and from their faces I could tell they were beginning to grasp just how closely the HOA monitored their activities. Once Clark realized we'd spotted him, he slipped back toward the community center, though not before taking one last photo of the families enjoying themselves under the string lights. As guests packed up, Harold pulled me aside. His expression told me he had something important to share. "Frank fought the HOA once," he said in a low voice, making sure no one overheard. "Took them to court, won quietly, but the board never forgave him." Then he added something that sent a chill through me. He had once seen Victoria at the marina years earlier, marking areas with red tape, direct evidence tying her to the boundary manipulations I was beginning to uncover. When the last family headed back toward the community center, I switched off the lights and took in the success of the evening. For the first time since moving in, I felt like I had genuinely connected with my neighbors. Several thanked me for letting them enjoy part of the waterfront they had never set foot on before. But as I folded chairs and tidied up, I found an official-looking envelope slipped under my front door. Inside was a notice from Victoria announcing a mandatory inspection the next morning at 8 a.m., focused specifically on unauthorized gatherings and safety risks tied to unsupervised waterfront use. The timing made it obvious this was retaliation, but Harold wasn't finished. He leaned close and whispered, "You'll want to check the land deeds again. Frank left more behind than just docks." Monday morning arrived damp and gray, the kind of weather that casts a gloomy backdrop, fitting for what I expected to be my final showdown with Victoria and the board. The notice had ordered us to meet at 8 a.m. sharp at the community center. As I walked up, I saw residents trudging across the wet pavement, clearly resentful but unwilling to risk the consequences of staying home. Had spent Sunday night organizing every scrap of paperwork tied to my property, especially the new evidence my lawyer friend had uncovered about exclusive easements and waterfront rights. Victoria presided from the head table, flanked by Clark, and 2 other board members. Bankers' boxes filled with files were stacked around them, clearly intended to intimidate. Clark had even set up an easel with a large property map, though from the back of the room I couldn't make out much detail. The setup felt less like a community meeting and more like a courtroom, with Victoria posturing as both judge and jury, while residents were reduced to silent spectators. She opened by reading from a thick folder of what she claimed were the HOA's official bylaws and covenants. By her interpretation, private waterfront struck. The attorney's letter was packed with threatening language about seizing property and imposing financial penalties. But when I pressed Victoria to identify the exact legal authority that would let the HOA take my land, she started bringing up eminent domain and vague notions of community welfare. The entire pitch came across as a carefully staged bluff meant to intimidate me into compliance. Still, the looming threat of an actual lawsuit made it obvious that the situation had escalated. Someone was going to have to yield, or things would end in court. I let Victoria and Clark finish without interrupting, calmly taking notes as they spoke. I had already spotted multiple contradictions and shaky claims worth challenging. When it was my turn, I kept my composure and approached it, with the same steady, step-by-step reasoning I'd relied on throughout my logistics career. I laid 3 old property deeds on the table, handing copies to every board member, so there was no mistaking what they were seeing. "These aren't just relics of the past," I said firmly, meeting Victoria's eyes. "They're valid, recorded, and legally enforceable." The deeds proved ownership not only of the pier but also the submerged land surrounding the marina, giving me full control over water access, something Victoria clearly hadn't anticipated. The chain of title established a direct, unbroken line of ownership for my pier and waterfront rights going back to the original lake development in the 1960s. Unlike Victoria's blurry HOA bylaws, my documents included official county surveys and notarized deed transfers complete with seals and signatures. I explained the principle of exclusive easements in plain terms that everyone could follow, stressing that these rights had been in place long before the current HOA board ever existed. When Victoria tried to argue about community precedent and covenant interpretation, I countered calmly, "In every state, recorded easements override HOA bylaws. That's settled law." The most decisive moment came when I rolled out a waterline survey showing the exact boundaries of my access rights. The GPS coordinates matched perfectly with a boundary marker I had uncovered behind my cabin, and the legal description detailed marina upkeep obligations and liability coverage. I then asked Victoria directly how the HOA intended to provide alternative public access if they seized my pier. For the first time since meeting her, she was speechless. Instead of answering, she snapped, "You had no right to access those records," revealing that she thought the files were hidden. Clark only worsened things by blurting out, "You said nobody would ever find those folders," exposing their collusion and proving they had deliberately withheld information from the community. From there, the meeting unraveled. Residents started raising their own questions about the Marina Repair Fund, about the supposed need for the pier seizure. Megan Price pointed out that despite months of assessments, no actual improvements had been made. Another resident stood up and shouted, "You fined my father for painting his mailbox blue and you weren't even legitimate." Victoria tried to shut things down by threatening to end the meeting, but the residents weren't done demanding answers about where their money had gone. I quietly closed my folder and stood to speak one last time. The evidence I'd presented was undeniable, but I could already see Victoria plotting her next move to avoid facing the truth of my property rights. As I packed my materials, I knew the meeting had exposed just how weak the HOA's position really was, but also that Victoria wasn't going to retreat without a much larger fight. Before leaving, I slipped a final envelope from my folder, its label clearly visible, "Marina Title Transfer," notarized. The room went still as eyes locked on the envelope. And that's when everything shifted. Tuesday evening brought a twist I hadn't expected. Victoria called an emergency community meeting at my pier instead of the usual clubhouse. The notice in everyone's mailbox was short but urgent. Final resolution of pier dispute. All residents required to attend. 7:00 p.m. at waterfront property. The change struck me as strange. Victoria always thrived on the authority of presiding from the head table in the clubhouse. Standing on my dock seemed like a disadvantage, at least until I realized she was probably counting on the dramatic outdoor setting to give weight to her final ultimatum. As the sun dipped behind the pines, casting golden light across the lake, residents gathered on my dock. It would have been the perfect backdrop for a friendly community gathering if the atmosphere weren't so charged. Victoria arrived with Clark, the full HOA board, and a sharply dressed man who introduced himself as their attorney. They came loaded for battle, carrying briefcases and wearing grim expressions. More residents showed up than at any prior meeting, drawn by both curiosity and the promise of a conclusion. Victoria wasted no time. She declared that the HOA's legal research proved my pier fell under community control via maritime access. Regulations that overrode private property claims. Their lawyer stepped forward with a fat folder, claiming my refusal to grant community use violated navigational easements and promising immediate injunctive relief if I didn't comply. He insisted. They had documentation showing the pier was a community asset dating back to original county permits. I was given exactly 5 minutes to look over their evidence before deciding whether to sign an access agreement. I flipped through the folder, pretending to study it closely, though I already knew what it contained. The so-called evidence was the same tired bylaws and covenants Victoria had been waving around for weeks, padded with official-looking forms asserting community authority over waterfront structures. The county permits were genuine, but they referred to marina development in general, not to ownership of my pier, and they included details Victoria's side had clearly missed. When my 5 minutes were up, I stepped to the center of the pier, where all could see me. "Before I respond to these threats," I said, locking eyes with Victoria and then turning to the crowd, "I have one question, and I'm sure your lawyer can answer it. Does your claim to this pier, your supposed community asset, include the submerged land beneath it?" Victoria stiffened, and her lawyer hesitated before finally replying. "No, the HOA's claim is limited to surface rights and covenants. The land beneath falls under county jurisdiction." I nodded. "Exactly." Then I reached into my jacket and drew out the same sealed envelope everyone had seen at the last meeting. The tension was heavy in the air. I opened it and revealed the document inside, a deed transfer from last spring showing that the entire Lakeview Marina had been sold by Morrison Holdings LLC to my property management company. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Murmurs spread. Everyone was stunned. Everyone except Harold, who simply nodded, as though he had suspected this moment all along. I picked up the deed again and kept reading, explaining that Frank Morrison hadn't only owned the pier and cabin he'd sold me, he had in fact held ownership of every dock slip and water access point within the entire marina system for more than 3 decades. The next document I introduced was even more devastating to Victoria's stance. It was a liability insurance policy proving that the HOA had been paying me monthly premiums for marina upkeep and emergency coverage ever since I closed on the property. Under Easement Code 42B and the state-recognized boundary statutes, the land was officially exempt from HOA oversight. I read the legal terminology directly, making sure the language spoke for itself. The insurance contract revealed that the community association had been categorized as nothing more than a tenant organization with limited authority to coordinate resident access, but with zero ownership or management rights over the marina itself. Victoria's face drained of all color as I read, and I could see her attorney nervously rifling through his papers, desperate for some kind of rebuttal. The reaction from the crowd was instant and overwhelming. Megan stepped forward first. "You let her push us around? We never knew the truth about who really owned this place." Harold raised his finger, his voice firm. "I told them years ago Frank had protections they couldn't touch. Now it's all out in the open." 2. Residents who had previously backed the HOA during community meetings came up to me and publicly apologized for not questioning Victoria's authority sooner. Those who had stood behind her began demanding answers about why they'd never been told about the insurance payments or the real ownership arrangement. Harold's wife, who had never once spoken up at a community meeting, asked why the board had been collecting funds for marina repairs on a facility they neither owned nor controlled. Victoria tried to keep her composure, but I could see the panic setting in, as her carefully crafted story unraveled in front of everyone. One board member, not Clark, slipped quietly away, tossing their ID badge onto the dock as if they wanted nothing further to do with the scheme. Victoria attempted to speak again, insisting there had been misunderstandings about the documents, but someone in the crowd interrupted. They were already live streaming the meeting on their phone. "Keep going, we're recording this," the resident called out. Victoria immediately fell silent. Clark made one last, desperate attempt, claiming the easement paperwork was forged, and that my lawyer friend had fabricated evidence to back my position. The claim was so absurd that several residents laughed out loud. Even Victoria looked embarrassed by her enforcer's desperation. I calmly responded by offering to provide certified copies of all documents to anyone who wanted to check their authenticity, and I invited the HOA's attorney to verify everything, directly with the county recorder's office. The lawyer quietly packed up his files and left, realizing his clients had misled him about the very foundation of their case. As the meeting wound down, I made an announcement I'd been considering since Saturday's Pier gathering. Rather than dealing with HOA fees and endless bureaucracy, I proposed creating direct agreements with individual residents who wanted marina access, cutting the association out entirely, and eliminating the $200 seasonal fee Victoria had been pushing for. As people stepped aside to let me through, someone whispered, "You saved this place." I didn't reply. I simply walked toward the dock, finally and unquestionably mine. By Wednesday morning, the news had spread. Victoria had submitted her resignation as HOA president, effective immediately, along with formal resignations from Clark and 2 other board members. The announcement, printed on HOA letterhead, carried a tone unlike Victoria's usual authoritative style. Instead of confident explanations and legal justifications, it was curt and defensive, citing irreconcilable differences in leadership philosophy and outside pressures that had made governance impossible. But it was clear to everyone what had really happened. Victoria's support had collapsed completely once residents discovered the truth about marina ownership and the hidden financial mismanagement. That evening, at an emergency meeting, Harold Green was elected interim HOA president. His first act was to order a full audit of the association's finances going back 3 years. The accounting firm he brought in specialized in forensic investigations of nonprofits, and their preliminary findings were even worse than I had imagined. According to the report, the HOA's Marina Repair Fund had collected more than $120,000 in special assessments and maintenance fees since Victoria took office, yet only about $30,000 could be tied to legitimate marina expenses. The remainder had been funneled into vague categories like administrative consulting and emergency infrastructure planning, obvious cover for personal spending and unauthorized transfers. The forensic audit uncovered a pattern of financial abuse that extended far beyond the marina issue. Victoria had been using HOA credit cards for personal purchases. They had been spending community money on personal luxuries, things like dining out, vacations, and home renovations, completely unrelated to neighborhood affairs. Clark, meanwhile, had been collecting monthly payments for so-called security consulting. The problem was he had no credentials, no license, and no real background in security management. Still, the board had signed off on these expenses with no paperwork or accountability, simply relying on Victoria's word that it was all for the community's benefit. Once the audit findings were made public, the fallout was immediate. County prosecutor launched a criminal case for embezzlement and misuse of association funds. Victoria was half a year later, the marina was running smoother than anyone could remember. The volunteer system drew in eager participation, giving residents a direct role in maintaining the space they used. Without the seasonal fees Victoria had wanted, families who couldn't afford access before were finally able to enjoy the lake. And with transparent leadership, every decision was made openly, with input from the entire community. I replaced the old private pier sign with a new one, community access by owner permission. It symbolized the new cooperative spirit we had built together. Standing there at sunset, watching families laugh and fish from docks that once caused so much conflict, I felt a deep sense of relief. Not pride, but peace. The breeze off the water carried more than summer air. It carried proof that the struggle had been worth it. I pulled out my phone, ready to record what peace looked like after months of turmoil. Before I pressed record, I reached into my pocket and ran my fingers over Frank's old brass key. Maybe the real takeaway is this: some things aren't meant to be controlled. They're meant to be cared for, then passed on. If you're still watching, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've ever had to stand firm for something bigger than yourself. And if this story resonated with you and you want to help the channel grow, you can always hit that little Thanks button below. Take care of your piece of the world. Someone else might need it more than you realize. Thanks for sticking with us here at QA Stories. Don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss what's coming next, because things are only going to get wilder from here.